She'd been loading luggage for 3 years when the emergency alarm blared and the control tower announced that Flight 447 was going down with 200 passengers aboard. No pilots were available for rescue. That's when Alex dropped her baggage cart, walked into the cockpit, and revealed a secret that would shock the entire aviation world. Welcome to Those Who Left a Trace, where ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets. Before we dive into this incredible story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about courage and hidden talents, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that sometimes the most skilled hands belong to the most overlooked people, hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. Alex Thompson had been invisible for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone at Denver International Airport was counting, especially not the pilots who hurried past her on the tarmac without a second glance, or the flight attendants who barely acknowledged her presence as she loaded their luggage into cargo holds with mechanical precision. At 31 years old, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulder-length auburn hair that she kept tucked beneath her regulation cap and piercing blue eyes that seemed to track every aircraft movement, even when she wasn't supposed to be watching. She wore the bright orange vest of the baggage handling crew, her movements efficient and practiced as she maneuvered heavy carts across the endless expanse of concrete, invisible to a world that had forgotten she existed. The transformation from Captain Alex Thompson, one of the youngest commercial airline pilots ever certified to fly wide-body aircraft, to Alex the baggage handler had not happened overnight. It had been a gradual descent into anonymity, orchestrated by an aviation disaster that had destroyed her reputation, her career, and very nearly her will to live. The crash had been caused by a mechanical failure that no pilot could have prevented, but the subsequent investigation had focused on human error, and Alex had become a convenient scapegoat for an airline industry more interested in protecting corporate liability than discovering the truth. Flight 1247 had been her command, a routine Denver to Los Angeles run on a clear Tuesday morning in March. 237 passengers, 12 crew members, and a Boeing 777 that she had flown dozens of times before. The hydraulic failure had occurred at 38,000 feet, sudden and catastrophic, leaving her with minimal control surfaces and no manual backup systems. She had fought for 43 minutes to bring the aircraft down safely, using techniques that weren't in any manual, improvising solutions that no simulator had ever presented. She had saved every single life aboard that aircraft, executing an emergency landing that aviation experts would later call miraculous. But the airline's legal team had needed someone to blame, and a young female pilot was an easier target than admitting their maintenance protocols were inadequate. The investigation had been predetermined, the findings manipulated, and Alex's career had been destroyed by executives who had never spent a day in a cockpit, but understood perfectly how to manipulate public perception. The media campaign against her had been ruthless and systematic. Television news programs featured expert commentators who questioned her decision-making during the crisis, despite never having experienced similar emergencies themselves. Aviation blogs published detailed analyses of her flying record, searching for any minor infractions or training deficiencies that could be twisted to support the narrative of pilot error. Social media became a battleground where anonymous accounts spread rumors about her personal life, her relationships, and her psychological fitness for duty. Her former colleagues, the ones she considered friends and trusted allies, began distancing themselves from her as the controversy intensified. Pilots who had once sought her advice and admired her skills suddenly avoided her calls and declined to provide character references for her defense. The aviation community, which had once celebrated her as a rising star, now treated her as a pariah whose very presence threatened their own careers and reputations. The media had crucified her, painting her as an inexperienced pilot who had panicked under pressure. Her fellow pilots, the ones she thought were friends and colleagues, had remained silent, unwilling to risk their own careers by defending her. The Federal Aviation Administration had revoked her license pending a full investigation that stretched on for months, during which time she was unemployable, and slowly watching her savings disappear. The legal proceedings have been a nightmare of depositions, expert testimony, and character assassination that stretched on for 18 months. Alex had been forced to relive the emergency over and over again, explaining her split-second decisions to lawyers who had never been inside an aircraft cockpit. Every choice she had made during those 43 minutes was scrutinized, questioned, and presented as evidence of her incompetence, despite the undeniable fact that everyone aboard Flight 1247 had survived. Her marriage had not survived the ordeal. Her husband, David Reeves, a successful corporate attorney, had initially supported her through the investigation, but had gradually grown distant as the media attention intensified. He worried about the impact on his own career, his reputation within the legal community, and his prospect for partnership at his prestigious law firm. The divorce had been finalized 6 months after her license was revoked, adding personal devastation to her professional ruin. By the time independent investigators had uncovered evidence that vindicated her, the damage was irreversible. The airline had paid massive settlements to passengers claiming emotional trauma, settlements that came with ironclad non-disclosure agreements that prevented anyone from discussing the true cause of the incident. Alex's license was eventually restored, but no airline would hire her. Her name had become synonymous with the Flight 1247 incident, and hiring managers would rather choose less qualified candidates than deal with the perceived liability of employing her. The job at Denver International had been a last resort, a way to pay rent and remain connected, however tangentially, to the aviation world she loved. She had applied under her maiden name, Thompson, instead of her married name, Reeves, and had been hired as part of the baggage handling crew. The irony was not lost on her that she was now loading the same aircraft she had once commanded, working for minimum wage while pilots with half her experience flew overhead. The irony was not lost on her that Rodriguez now occupied the office that should have been hers, flew routes that she could handle in her sleep, and supervised training programs that had been built on safety protocols she had helped develop. He had even given interviews citing the lessons learned from the Flight 1247 incident, careful to distance himself from her name while building his reputation on the foundation of her tragedy. During her years of exile, Alex had maintained her certifications by taking recurrent training courses at her own expense, studying new regulations and procedures during her off hours, and completing flight simulator sessions whenever she could afford them. She refused to let her skills atrophy, despite having no realistic prospect of ever using them professionally again. The other pilots of the training facility sometimes recognize her, their expressions shifting from confusion to embarrassment as they remember who she was and what had happened to her career. But on this particular Thursday afternoon in October, everything was about to change because of Flight 447, a routine Denver to Seattle run that had become anything but routine when both engines failed simultaneously at 15,000 feet, leaving 200 passengers and 8 crew members in an aircraft that was essentially a very heavy glider. The pilots had radioed for emergency assistance, but Denver International was experiencing the worst possible scenario. The 3 most experienced emergency response pilots were either sick on vacation or dealing with their own mechanical issues. Captain Rodriguez was grounded with a severe case of food poisoning that had left him unable to stand, let alone fly. Captain Williams was in Phoenix dealing with a family emergency. Captain Davis was already airborne in another aircraft, 40 minutes away from being able to respond. The only pilots available were first-year co-pilots who had never handled an emergency of this magnitude, and protocol strictly forbade them from attempting a rescue operation without supervision. The situation had developed rapidly and without warning. Flight 447 had departed Denver on schedule, climbing normally through clear skies toward their cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. The first engine failure had occurred at 14,000 feet during the initial climb, caused by what would later be determined to be a catastrophic turbine blade separation. The pilots had followed standard procedures, shutting down the affected engine and preparing for a single-engine approach back to Denver. But as they began their emergency descent, the second engine had suffered a complete oil loss, forcing them to shut it down as well to prevent an uncontained failure that could have sent shrapnel through the passenger cabin. Suddenly, Flight 447 had become a glider with limited time and distance to reach a suitable landing site. The pilots had declared an emergency and begun calculating their options, all of which seemed to end in disaster. Alex was loading baggage into a cargo hold when she heard the commotion, the urgent voices of ground control calling for qualified pilots, any qualified pilots, to respond to the emergency. She paused in her work and listened as the control tower coordinator tried to explain to the airport administrator that they had no one available to guide Flight 447 through an emergency landing, that they were looking at a potential catastrophe with no immediate solution. She could hear the stress in their voices, the growing panic as they realized the magnitude of the situation. Flight 447 was losing altitude rapidly, and without experienced guidance from the ground or a rescue pilot to talk them through the emergency procedures, the aircraft would likely crash within 20 minutes. The pilots aboard Flight 447 were competent for normal operations, but they had never trained for a complete dual-engine failure, and their stress was evident in their increasingly frantic radio transmissions. Alex found herself walking toward the control tower, her feet moving without conscious direction, her mind already calculating the approach vectors and emergency procedures that would be required to save the aircraft and everyone aboard. She had trained for this exact scenario dozens of times, had actually experienced a similar emergency during her own career, and knew exactly what guidance the pilots would need to maximize their chances of survival. She stopped at the base of the control tower and looked up at the windows where air traffic controllers were coordinating what might become the worst aviation disaster in Denver International's history. Through her earpiece, which was tuned to ground control frequencies as part of her baggage handling duties, she could hear the increasing desperation in the voices of both the pilots in the air and the controllers on the ground. This was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She could walk away, return to her baggage cart, and continue loading luggage, let the emergency unfold without her involvement, and watch 200 people die because she was too afraid to reveal who she really was. Or she could step forward, expose herself to all the risks that had terrified her for 3 years, and do what she had been trained to do: save lives. The pilots of Flight 447 were reporting complete hydraulic failure, along with the engine problems, which meant they had limited control surfaces and would need to execute a dead-stick landing using only gravity and airspeed to control their descent. It was one of the most difficult emergency procedures in aviation, requiring split-second timing and an intuitive understanding of aircraft physics that took years to develop. Alex made her decision. She walked into the control tower, past security personnel who recognized her baggage handling credentials, and approached the emergency coordination center, where a dozen air traffic controllers were working frantically to find a solution to an impossible problem. The tower supervisor, a man named Henderson whom she had observed but never spoken to, was coordinating multiple radio channels while trying to locate any qualified pilot who could provide emergency assistance. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos with an authority that made Henderson pause mid-sentence. "I can help." Henderson looked at her with the kind of expression reserved for people who had clearly lost their minds. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You need to return to your assigned duties immediately." "I'm a certified airline pilot," Alex said simply, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I can talk them through the emergency landing procedures." The control room fell silent. A dozen faces turned toward her, ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. Henderson's expression cycled through irritation, confusion, and something that might have been desperate hope. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but this is not the time for games. We need qualified professionals to handle this emergency." Alex walked to the nearest communication console and placed her hand on the microphone switch. "Flight 447, this is emergency ground control. Report your current altitude, airspeed, and control surface responsiveness." The response came immediately, crackling with static and stress. "Ground control, Flight 447. We're at 12,000 feet, airspeed 185 knots, descending at approximately 800 feet per minute. We have minimal elevator control and no aileron response. Request immediate guidance for emergency approach." Alex's voice was calm and professional, carrying the authority of someone who had been in this exact situation before. "Flight 447, understand dual engine failure with hydraulic loss. You're going to execute a modified dead stick approach using differential thrust and elevator trim. First, reduce your rate of descent by pulling back gently on your yoke. Don't overcorrect. Henderson stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. The radio chatter that followed was textbook emergency coordination, with Alex providing step-by-step guidance that demonstrated an intimate understanding of both the aircraft's capabilities and the physics of emergency flight. "Who are you?" Henderson whispered, but Alex was already fully focused on the emergency, her attention divided between the radar screens showing Flight 447's position and the radio communications that would determine whether 200 people lived or died. For the next 18 minutes, Alex Thompson ceased to be a baggage handler and became what she had always been, one of the most skilled pilots of her generation. She guided the crew of Flight 447 through a series of complex maneuvers, teaching them to use their remaining control surfaces in ways that weren't covered in standard training, helping them understand how to manage their aircraft's energy state during an approach that left no room for error. She calculated wind drift and approach angles in her head, while simultaneously coaching the pilots through psychological techniques for maintaining focus under extreme stress. She anticipated their questions before they asked them, provided solutions for problems they didn't even know they would encounter, and displayed a level of expertise that left the experienced air traffic controllers in the tower speechless. "Flight 447, you need to understand your energy management right now," Alex continued, her voice steady as a metronome. "With no engines, you're trading altitude for airspeed. At your current descent rate, you have approximately 12 minutes to touch down. I need you to extend your flaps to position 2, not full extension, position 2 only. This will give you better control authority, without creating too much drag." The pilot's voice came back, strained but following her instructions precisely. "Roger. Extending flaps to position 2. We're showing some response improvement in elevator control." "Excellent. Now listen carefully. You're going to perform what we call a slip approach. Bank the aircraft slightly to the left while applying right rudder pressure. This will steepen your descent without building airspeed. Practice this maneuver now while you still have altitude to work with." Henderson found himself holding his breath as he watched Alex work. Every instruction she gave was followed by an immediate improvement in Flight 447's flight path. The aircraft, which had been wallowing in an uncontrolled descent just minutes earlier, was now responding to the crew's inputs with increasing precision. The tower chief, a 30-year veteran named Patricia Walsh, approached Henderson's station. "Sir, I've never seen emergency coordination like this. Whoever she is, she's saving that airplane." Through the tower windows, they could see Flight 447 in the distance, a silver speck against the darkening sky that was growing larger as it approached the airport. Alex continued her radio guidance, walking the crew through each phase of the approach with the patience of a flight instructor and the urgency of someone who understood that lives hung on every word. "Flight 447, you're now 3 miles from runway threshold. Begin your final configuration. Landing gear down, flaps to position 3. Your approach speed should be 140 knots, no slower. Remember, you have no go-around capability, so this approach must be perfect." The tension in the control tower was palpable as everyone watched the aircraft's final approach. Alex stood at the radio console, her eyes fixed on the radar screen that showed Flight 447's altitude decreasing in a perfect glide slope toward the runway. Every controller in the tower had stopped their normal duties to watch this life-and-death drama unfold. "Flight 447, you're looking perfect. 2 miles out, on glide path. Start your flare in 30 seconds. When I say now, ease back on the yoke gradually. Don't pull, ease back. Your touchdown zone is the first third of the runway." The aircraft appeared in their line of sight now, its approach angle steep but controlled. Alex grabbed a pair of binoculars and focused on the aircraft's configuration, checking that all her instructions had been followed correctly. "Flight 447, you're on final approach. Runway 16 right is cleared for emergency landing. Fire and rescue teams are standing by. Remember to keep your nose slightly high during touchdown to prevent porpoising, and don't apply brakes until your airspeed drops below 60 knots. The aircraft appeared on the horizon, descending at an angle that looked impossibly steep to untrained eyes, but was exactly correct for their energy state and available control authority. Alex watched through binoculars as the crew executed her instructions with precision, bringing the massive aircraft down in a landing that would later be described by aviation experts as one of the most skillful emergency procedures ever recorded. Now, Flight 447, begin your flare. Ease back, hold it there. Flight 447 touched down smoothly on the runway centerline, its wheels making contact with barely a bounce. The aircraft rolled straight down the runway, gradually slowing as the pilots applied gentle braking pressure, according to Alex's instructions. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft, but their services proved unnecessary as Flight 447 came to a safe stop approximately halfway down the runway. Flight 447 is down safely, came the relieved voice of the pilot. All passengers and crew are unharmed. We owe our lives to whoever was providing that guidance. Flight 447 touched down smoothly, rolled to a stop on the runway, and came to rest surrounded by emergency vehicles whose services were ultimately unnecessary. Every passenger and crew member aboard walked away from the aircraft without serious injury, save by the expertise of a woman who had been loading their luggage just 30 minutes earlier. As the emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and the passengers began their evacuation, Henderson turned to Alex with an expression of awe and confusion that would haunt him for years. "Who are you really?" he asked. Alex removed the headset and set it carefully on the communication console. For the first time in 3 years, she spoke her real name with pride rather than shame. "I'm Captain Alex Thompson, and I just remember why I became a pilot." The control tower erupted in spontaneous applause, but Alex barely heard it. She was watching Flight 447's passengers disembarking safely, families reuniting, children running toward parents who had feared they might never see them again. This was why she had endured 3 years of exile, why she had maintained her certifications and studied every advancement in aviation safety, why she had never given up hope that someday she would fly again. The recognition came swiftly and dramatically. Within hours, word of the emergency landing had spread throughout the aviation industry, through social media, news reports, and a tight-knit community of pilots and air traffic controllers who understood the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Videos of Flight 447's perfect landing, recorded by airport security cameras and passenger phones, went viral on aviation websites and news networks. The woman who had been dismissed as the pilot responsible for Flight 1247's troubles was suddenly being hailed as a hero who had saved Flight 447. Investigation into her background revealed not the incompetent pilot that airline executives had portrayed, but one of the most qualified emergency response specialists in commercial aviation. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an immediate review of her case, discovering evidence that had been suppressed during the original investigation. Internal documents from the airline showed that executives had known about the hydraulic system defects that caused Flight 1247's emergency, but had chosen to blame pilot error, rather than admit to a maintenance program that prioritized cost savings over safety. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. A congressional investigation revealed that the airline had systematically covered up maintenance issues for years, bribing inspectors and falsifying records to avoid costly repairs. Alex had been chosen as a scapegoat not because of any failure on her part, but because her youth and gender made her an easier target than addressing systemic problems that could have cost the company billions in liability. Captain Rodriguez, the chief pilot who had built his reputation by distancing himself from Alex's supposed failures, suddenly found himself defending decisions he had never made and expertise he had never possessed. The comparison between his by-the-book competence and Alex's innovative emergency management was stark and unflattering. Within a week, 3 major airlines had offered Alex positions as chief pilot or director of emergency training. The same industry that had blacklisted her for 3 years was now competing for her expertise, recognizing that her experience with real emergency situations made her far more valuable than pilots who had never faced genuine crises. But the most meaningful recognition came from Captain Morrison, the pilot of Flight 447, who sought her out personally to thank her for saving his crew and passengers. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who had never experienced anything approaching the emergency he had faced that day. I don't know how you did what you did, he told her. The guidance you provided, the way you anticipated every problem before we even knew we had them. That wasn't just knowledge, that was artistry. Alex accepted the praise gracefully, but she knew the truth was simpler than artistry. She had spent 3 years studying every aspect of aviation safety, analyzing every emergency procedure, learning from every accident and incident report. Her forced exile from flying had paradoxically made her a better pilot by forcing her to understand the theoretical foundations of everything she had previously done by instinct. The passengers of Flight 447 organized a ceremony to thank her personally. Families who feared they would never see each other again stood in the airport terminal where Alex had worked anonymously for 3 years, now recognizing her as the person who had given them their lives back. Children drew pictures of airplanes for her. Parents spoke through tears about the future they had thought was lost, and elderly passengers told her she was an angel sent from heaven. The baggage car that Alex had pushed for 3 years was retired, replaced by a new one used by someone else who needed a chance to start over. Alex kept her orange safety vest in her office, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of perseverance, of the truth that sometimes we have to lose everything before we can discover what we're truly capable of achieving. She never forgot the 3 years she had spent invisible on the tarmac, loading luggage for aircraft she could have flown better than their assigned pilots. Those years had taught her humility, determination, and the understanding that respect must be earned through performance rather than demanded through position. She treated every pilot under her supervision with the same consideration she had wished for during her years of exile, ensuring that no one would ever be dismissed without a fair hearing. The Denver International Airport Control Tower, where she had revealed her identity, was renamed the Thompson Emergency Response Center, honoring the woman who had demonstrated that expertise could emerge from the most unexpected places. Alex attended the dedication ceremony alongside the passengers and crew of Flight 447, surrounded by colleagues who had once ignored her existence and now considered her the most capable pilot they had ever worked with. But Alex knew that she wasn't extraordinary. She was simply someone who had refused to give up when the entire industry had turned against her, someone who had maintained her skills and her passion, even when there seemed to be no hope of ever using them again. The 3 years of loading baggage had not been wasted time, but preparation for the moment when her expertise would matter most. The woman who had been invisible for 3 years had finally learned how to be seen again, not by demanding recognition, but by demonstrating value when it mattered most. And in saving Flight 447, she had not only redeemed her own career, but had reminded the entire aviation industry that competence could be found in the most unlikely places, that heroes often wore orange safety vests rather than captain stripes, and that sometimes the most important flight of your career happened when you were standing on the ground. Flight 447's emergency landing became a case study in aviation schools around the world, not just for the technical excellence of the approach, but for the reminder that expertise could emerge from exile, that careers could be reborn from ashes, and that the most valuable pilots were often those who had learned to value every opportunity to serve others through their skills. Alex Thompson returned to the sky not as a young pilot who had been destroyed by corporate politics, but as a mature professional who understood that flying was not about personal glory, but about the sacred responsibility of keeping people safe. And every time she took command of an aircraft, she remembered the 3 years she had spent on the ground, learning that sometimes you have to lose your wings before you can truly understand how precious it is to fly.